Thanks again for joining us. As I indicated, this webinar is being organized by the America-Israel Friendship League. A short 8 weeks ago, our nations, Israel, the United States, together with the rest of the world, Western world, entered into an unprecedented lockdown, economic and social. The COVID-19 crisis started a few short months beforehand in China, and it quickly impacted the world in a way that no one could have imagined possible. With it started a race for information. How do we minimize the impact of the epidemic? How do we identify who is at risk? How do we help cure those who've been infected? And how do we help prevent people from getting infected to begin with? Over the last century, we have witnessed several such global health crises, starting with the Spanish flu at the outset of World War I, the crippling polio epidemic in the 50s, the battle against HIV and AIDS in the 80s, and the successful containment of SARS less than 20 years ago. But never in human history have we witnessed a health crisis with a global impact like that of COVID-19. This global impact includes both a physical and a mental toll. It has created widespread uncertainty and anxiety. It's also, as is typical at times of crisis, we rise to the occasion. We're seeing not only tremendous resources invested in containment and in treatment, but we also see global pillars of support, compassion, and hope. Many people are braving their fears and anxieties to help others. And this is what makes us as humans unique. That's what promotes us to have hope to trump fear. This webinar is our contribution as an organization to this effort. It is part of our Friends Indeed campaign, a campaign dedicated to help where we can as an organization, organizing activity webinars designed to shift the attention at home from the daily routine of isolation, information webinars that are designed to educate the audience, as well as our weekly donation campaign, where our organization is making weekly donation of Israeli sweets to bring out to medical staff around the country that are putting aside their personal concerns and fears to provide the necessary medical attention. In this webinar, we'll try to shed some light into the tunnel. Experts from Israel and the United States will share information on the efforts that will hopefully lead us to help develop a vaccine that will help prevent people from being infected. I would like to introduce our co-sponsor of this event, Steve Schaufield, founder and chief investment officer of Blue Star Indexes, which focuses upon the evaluation, analysis, and tracking of Israeli capital markets. Steve.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you to all of you for participating in this webinar. AIFL is a fantastic and very unique organization. For over 50 years, it has brought America and Israel closer together through its programs, its leadership, delegations to Israel, and webinars like this. I've personally had the privilege of participating in AIFL events for almost a decade, and Blue Star has been a supporter of AIFL's mission and activities since our founding in 2011. Therefore, we're very happy to partner with AIFL to bring this timely session to you. At Blue Star, we fully relate to the mission of AIFL. We are a New York-based financial index company built by a group of Americans to help facilitate U.S. investment into the Israeli public market. We believe that we've added a new dimension to the term being invested in Israel by facilitating alignment of investors' values with their portfolios, enabling a new way to support Israel beyond activism and charity. We consider ourselves as having a vital role to benchmark Israel's capital markets and as a thought leader on Israel's economy and its innovation ecosystem. Our family of bond and stock indexes provide a complete picture of Israel's dynamic economy. And what makes us unique is that we capture Israeli companies, whether they're listed in Tel Aviv, New York, London, Australia, even Hong Kong and Singapore. Our sub-indexes enable investors to analyze key sectors: biotech, medical devices, health tech, pharma, all of which Israel leads in. You can also access our research from our website. I just want to spend a minute explaining Israel's innovative landscape. This is an area where Israel is both leading the world, collaborating with the rest of the world, and Israeli companies, whether Teva, Intercure, Stratasys, are all innovating and ramping up production to address different aspects of the coronavirus crisis. This innovation is being mobilized as Israel's implementing its relatively successful policy response to the COVID-19 crisis. Without a doubt, Israel is punching above its weight in the race to medication and vaccines that will benefit the entire world. Furthermore, Israel's innovation ecosystem is truly unique, multinational, and well represented by the institutions and panelists we have on the call. According to Blue Star's data set, there are 394 global or non-Israeli public companies that impact Israel's economy through R&D facilities, investments, strategic partnerships, including partnerships with Israel's world-leading universities. About a third of those are in technology and 13% are in healthcare. And of course, Bristol-Myers Squibb is a prominent constituent in this data set. Notably, Israel has the highest ratio of R&D spending to GDP in the developed world, 4.5%, and more than 2/3 of that is performed by foreign companies operating in Israel. Finally, just to link back to today's webinar, it shouldn't surprise anyone that as we look to the future and how the world will move to treat and ultimately overcome this current crisis, it's appropriate that the AIFL is hosting this webinar. AIFL's mission is to increase understanding of Israel's contemporary reality, its entrepreneurship, its medical research, agricultural and technological progress. I'm proud that Blue Star has worked together with AIFL since 2011, and we will continue to partner with you to advance our shared vision of a strong, mutually beneficial U.S.-Israel relationship. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jonathan, and I'm looking forward to hearing what our panelists have to share with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. I would like to now briefly introduce our panel. Dr. Laura Betham is a former physician and retired pharmaceutical executive, leading the research and introduction of medications over at Bristol-Myers used for the treatment of HIV and AIDS. Dr. Betham is probably as close as one can get to saying she's been here and done this. Dr. Freund is an infectious disease researcher at the Department of Immunology at Tel Aviv University. She's currently investigating and researching the use of human antibodies in responses towards infectious diseases such as COVID-19. And then finally, Mati Gil, Director of Public Policy at Teva Pharmaceutical Industries. Teva is an industry giant, a global leader in developing, manufacturing, and distributing pharmaceutical and medicines to over 200 million people around the world on a daily basis. Before we turn over to the panel, what we would like to do is show a brief animation that describes what vaccines are, how they work, so that for us lay people, we'll sort of have the same starting point.
We train our bodies to recognize and fend off germs before they make us sick. Traditionally, vaccines are made using viruses that have been killed or weakened, like vaccines against the flu or measles. But growing viruses is labor-intensive and sometimes risky. Now, scientists are using newer and faster technology to create different types of vaccines against COVID-19. There's no chance people could get infected from the shots because they don't contain the virus itself. Target: a spiky protein that covers the new coronavirus. That protein lets the virus invade human cells. If the body's immune system recognizes the spike and blocks it, people won't get infected. One way is to copy a section of the viruses that instructs cells to make the spike protein. Stick that messenger RNA into a vaccine. The person's own cells will make the harmless protein. Then the immune system will spot the foreign proteins and make antibodies to attack them. Another method is called a DNA vaccine. Genetic code for the spike protein is put into what's called a plasmid, a circular piece of synthetic DNA, and used as a vaccine. Both approaches prime the immune system to attack again if the real virus ever comes along. Whatever type of vaccine ultimately works, it likely will be 12 to 18 months before it's ready for widespread use.
Laura, you worked on the development of drugs that were used for the treatment of HIV infection. Based on what you know of the coronavirus, what kind of similarities or differences are there in the response to the virus?
So similarities to both the HIV virus and the coronavirus is that they came over from animals. And so none of the humans had any exposure to these. And so there were no antibodies. And so when you think entering into the human body, the first line of defense is the immune system. And since there are no antibodies that are currently present, there really is very difficult for patients and people to respond to those antibodies. And that was the same with HIV and the same with the coronaviruses. The differences are the populations and the way that the viruses are being transmitted. And with the coronavirus, it's actually a virus that transmitted respiratory-wise, from what we know now mostly. And many of the patients are asymptomatic. And so a lot of people are getting infected that way. And we just don't have the predisposed and we haven't seen this disease before to actually really have it stopped in its tracks.
Thanks, but you know what, let's, as I think about it, sort of for people like myself, I'd like to actually take a step backwards and actually, let's bring us back to basics. What, we hear a lot about vaccination and medication. What really is the difference between the two? I mean, what's the difference between vaccination and medication?
Sure. So first, Jonathan, thank you for also asking me to attend. I'm really excited to be on the panel with Natalia and Mati, who are experts in their fields as well. So really simple, we all look at diseases, and as scientists, we try to really understand the mechanism of the diseases and how the diseases work, and then we decide, all right, how are we going to go after these diseases? So a drug is basically a substance or a chemical that's usually a small molecule where we understand the mechanism of the disease, whether it be high cholesterol or hypertension, and we find a way to use that chemical substance to interfere with the mechanism and actually either lower people's blood pressure or lower people's cholesterol. So medications and small molecules are relatively easy to make. A vaccine, on the other hand, as you nicely saw from that lovely video, is you need to find a part of the virus or take the virus in a modified form so it doesn't cause infection, grow that virus or replicate that part of the virus, and then inject it into a human being and hope that elicits an immune response. It makes antibodies that actually will stop the infection or somehow mitigate the disease. And so they're very different in terms of the time it takes to develop one, the ease it is to produce one, and how we find one.
I think I can actually even understand that one.
Good.
So, Natalia, in the world of research, can you shed some light on what are the different approaches in researching a vaccine versus a medication?
Hi, yes. So first of all, Jonathan, thank you so much for inviting me. This is a really interesting panel, and it's really great to be introduced to this amazing organization. Yes, so as I agree with Laura, so medications are easier in a way to make because we have to find specific steps during the viral life cycle and basically block these steps. Another difference is that medication is something that you give to sick people as opposed to a vaccine that you give to healthy people. So the bar is much, much higher here. You have to have it extremely safe and extremely efficacious. So, if you're talking about drugs, 60% efficiency is something that probably won't do for a vaccine. So that's another difference. On the research front, I would say that my lab in Sackler, Tel Aviv is focusing on antibodies. And here, as Laura said, again, most of the medications are small molecules that can block specific steps in the viral life cycle, as opposed to a vaccine that engages, elicits the host immune response sort of making the host to produce a protective immunity, whether it's antibodies or cellular immunity. I think that here antibodies perhaps can offer sort of a bridge between the two, because we're talking about natural molecules that maybe can provide short-term protection, which is not in a way of active vaccine, but maybe in a way of sort of passive vaccine, sort of drug vaccine intermediate.
So if we take it for a moment from the world of research into the world of commerce, Matti, coming
Yes.
from the commercial environment, what would a pharmaceutical prefer to focus on? Vaccination, medication?
So first of all, Jonathan, thank you for inviting me, and thank you to the other panelists and to AIFL, as I'm a big fan of the organization, and we've been working with you for many years, and thank you, Ruby, for everything you do here in Israel. As you mentioned, Teva is a leader in generic medicines and biological research, biopharmaceutical research. And as Israel is a leader in this life sciences area, so the first drug that came out of Israel to actually treat patients and was approved by the FDA came from Teva in Copaxone. So we do have a long-standing relationship in developing medicines. Whether or not vaccinations or medicines really depends on the focus area of the specific company. So both vaccinations and medicines take years, as was seen before, to develop and have them approved. They take billions of dollars usually to be able to get a full medicine through the process and approved and into patients' hands. And most attempts fail. And it's good that right now, both in the vaccination space and the medicine space, that we have many shots on goal. The last time I checked, there were over 90 projects going on worldwide with the leading companies in the world involved in that, including projects coming from Israel, both in the vaccination and the medicine space. Teva specifically is not in the vaccination space. We've never been a company that develops vaccines. We've been a company that develops both innovative and generic medicines. So for a company like ours, we would only be involved in the medicine space. Other companies like Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, and others that are in the vaccination space have very heavily developed in that sense. So really in our industry, it requires focus and execution in your therapeutic areas and your capability, technological capabilities to be excellent in those. And I'm very optimistic now that the leading minds and the leading companies in the world are all focused on, and that we have so many shots on goal, are all focused in this area. So it leaves a lot of room for optimism.
And if I can add, because I don't think Matti's being a little modest, I think people have heard in the news that one of the first drugs that was repurposed was hydroxychloroquine.
Correct.
Because there was evidence from the first original SARS coronavirus that might have efficacy, and the world jumped on trying to really understand. And Teva, that is one of the medications that he mentioned that Teva made, and they've donated several millions or tens of millions of doses globally to be able to really continue the research. And they really came forward quicker than I've seen anybody come forward. So I have to congratulate them.
Thank you, Laura. I could just say on that spot, so once the government in the United States reached out to Teva to ask for hydroxychloroquine, upon very initial investigational usage, and I have to be careful here, it's not our decision as a pharmaceutical company what should be given to patients. But once we were asked to provide it, we took our full stock in the United States of 10 million drugs and donated free charge within 24 hours, and really had it delivered to patients' hands, and continuing to go to countries, including to India, to go get more stock of that and help supply it to patients, both in the United States and in Israel and in other countries as well.
So really, we've heard a lot about the you guys have got to change the name.
Hydroxychloroquine.
We do that on
learned how to
purpose.
pronounce it.
We do that on purpose, so you can only pronounce the brand name.
So, so we've heard a lot about it, basically. What is really the status of because I think it sort of stopped on the research phase. Can you really give us an update as to where we are on the research of it, of its efficacy?
Laura, do you want to take that one, or you
No,
want me to?
I'll try to take that one. So
Yeah,
the first reports that came out were very promising. They were early. There was not a lot of data. People were obviously, this is desperate times, takes for desperate measures. So people jumped on it. There are now controlled clinical trials going on. There's some little bit of data that's leaked out. Some of it's good, some of it's not so good. I think that the real problem with this disease is how to design a clinical trial, whether it be for a vaccine or for a medication, because we don't have many drugs available. Another drug that actually has emergency authorization in the United States is remdesivir. It was a drug, an antiviral that actually was originally made because of the Ebola virus. And so it happened to be sitting on the shelf and repurposed. This disease is one that we don't know. We'd like to usually give drugs, especially antivirals, as early, as soon as you know it's an infection. For people who've gotten the flu and you've given Tamiflu, you need to take it within the first 48 hours for it to work, right? We don't have that luxury here with this disease. And so I think as you study hydroxychloroquine or you study remdesivir, it's going to be interesting to see when the clinical trials come out. The remdesivir trial has already shown that for people who are in the hospital, moderately sick, that if you get remdesivir versus the control group, and it wasn't a real control group, it was just a cohort of patients, that patients got out of the hospital sooner, within 11 days versus 15 days. So there's a lot of unanswered questions as it relates to the drug, and so there's really no hard evidence except for the remdesivir that it decreases the length of the hospitalization,
which obviously results in lower research constraints on the hospital, which is good for everybody.
Right. It's a glimmer of hope.
Laura, what about toxicity of remdesivir? I heard that it had some adverse effects as well.
You know, I have not, Natalia, it's a great question. Since they really haven't seen the study published and presented yet, I haven't seen what the toxicity is yet. And so if you have information, just said, I know with the hydroxychloroquine, there's a question if you're very, very sick and get the drug later, there may be a poorer outcome in that population, but I haven't seen the remdesivir information yet.
Yeah, and just to mention that the NIH is doing a study on hydroxychloroquine, and which we're obviously very much supporting and providing medicines for that. So hopefully that will provide a little bit more clarity on the potential usefulness.
If I can just backtrack for a second to Natalia's question, if either Natalia or Laura, can you just again for the lay people like myself, if you can just explain so briefly with regard to the toxicity, what does that mean and the impact of that?
So I'll do this because I'm happy to. First and foremost, when you develop a drug or a vaccine, safety is probably pinnacle. I mean, not even the efficacy. When we first put drugs or vaccines into human beings, the first question we're really answering is this molecule safe? And so when you talk about toxicities, you talk about what are the adverse events or toxic things that happen to the body. Most drugs and antivirals somehow interfere with some of the normal mechanisms of the body. And so you have to wonder what how the side effects are. But first and foremost, anything that we put into people as researchers, as developer of drugs or vaccines, is the safety that we're concerned about.
And I'm assuming that also that a medication, for example, could be good under one dosage and high toxicity if it's under a different dosage.
Yeah, maybe this is a good time to kind of walk through kind of how you develop a vaccine or a drug.
You preempted my next question.
So, the first thing you need to do is you have to know the science and what the target's going to be. And so viruses are really, really interesting because they are not in themselves a live being or microbe. They really would depend on the host. And so taking apart a virus and really understanding a virus is a really interesting opportunity to either find a drug or a vaccine. The coronavirus is a unique experience that they were able to tear apart the genome within days, less than a week, of really having this new virus around because of all the work that's come before. But normally in vaccine development, I think Mati said it before, it takes years and many dollars. Both drugs and vaccines take billions of dollars and multiple years to develop them. And it's a very stepwise progression. Understand the target and identify the target. Then you find that target, try to make that target. Here you saw in the coronavirus video, it's the spike protein that most people are going after, or mRNA or DNA that will make that protein. Then you have to study it in animals. The animals serve, in the preclinical models, serve multiple purposes. Is it safe in those animals? And then do those animals produce an antibody, and do those antibodies neutralize the virus? You know, kill it, wipe it out, make sure it doesn't cause infection. It's a neutralizing antibody. From then, if you think you can proceed forward, then you actually go into humans. And the first trial, what we call phase 1 in humans, is really about the safety. Are you injecting something? And as Natalia said before, vaccines are going into healthy people. They're not sick people, right? So the bar is even higher there. And so is it healthy, and can they produce antibodies which will then be neutralizing to the vaccine? If you have that type of evidence, which we've already seen from the Moderna mRNA vaccine, that they've had phase 1 and they look like they have some evidence, so they're trying to place phase 2. And phase 2 is a larger group of patients, usually several hundred patients, where you would give the vaccine, continue to look at the safety, make sure they have antibodies, and then also look at when they get exposed to the disease, that they're not getting infected. And then you need a control group. And then in phase 3, it's much larger. Certain vaccines that are on the market take 30,000 to 70,000 patients to prove that they're safe and efficacious. We do not have that luxury of time here, right?
Sure.
And not only is it the clinical trials, but then you have to think about the manufacturing that goes along with it, because you don't usually manufacture at risk.
So it sounds, I mean, a lot of this obviously is highly regulated, basically sort of jumping through a lot of bureaucratic hurdles. So Matti, you know, you come from the world of policy, and I know that Teva is not necessarily involved in vaccination, but rather focuses more on medications, but I imagine it's very similar. So given the international crisis, do you anticipate some kind of breaking down of some of these regulations, or do you anticipate bureaucratic sort of being able to cut through the red tape?
So I think in general, governments and industry, whether innovative industry and startups or longstanding industry, are working very closely during this crisis, and with very intimate dialogue, both in Israel and in the United States and everywhere else around the world. So we are understanding, both governments and industry, that there is a mutual interest here to help save lives and bring our products to market as quickly as possible. Now, that does not mean that governments will enable industry to cut corners in evaluation of whether a medicine or vaccination is safe for patients, and nor should they. So what they can do, and they are doing, is streamlining processes for COVID type of trials where it might take months to get an approval to conduct a trial. In Israel, they have actually released and issued a regulation which you can now get a COVID approved trial for a COVID approved request within days, if not even hours. And that's where it really can matter, as well as on supply chain matters. So we, as the largest provider of medicines in the United States, have received a lot of support from the United States government, the Indian government, and other governments around the world to help bring our medicines from one country to another, because with the global supply chain, you require that assistance. So there is a lot of mutual dialogue and balancing between the interests of saving lives, but also keeping patients safe in investigational processes.
Interesting. So Natalia, if we go back into the world of research, looking at what we managed to learn from influenza, AIDS, and other infectious models, on the research side, what do you think are the main challenges that you're facing right now in the research into COVID-19 vaccinations?
Yeah, so I think it was mentioned earlier also in your video, and Laura touched this subject a little bit. I think that both HIV and SARS came from animals. They're also RNA viruses, the same as influenza. One of the problems with HIV and influenza is their rapid mutation rate, and the fact that these viruses are basically a moving target, and our immune system basically can't keep up with the pace of the virus. The virus keeps changing, and our antibodies are always one step behind, sort of. I think that in that sense, SARS is a little bit more stable because of the form of this virus. So it's not influenza is comprised of 8 segments of RNA, and the ability of the virus to sort of interchange these segments can cause big outbreaks like the swine flu that we saw a few years ago. And both influenza and HIV actually enter the nucleus of the cell. So HIV really integrates into our DNA, which makes it much harder to get it out. Basically, the only way to get rid of an HIV genome is to kill the cell. And we have the latency issue in HIV infection, where cells, some of the cells produce a lot of virions, and these virions keep infecting other cells, but the cells that are productively infected will eventually die because of the virus. However, the barrier for HIV eradication is the other population of cells, which are the latent cells, and these cells are quiescent, they're not producing virus, but they will wake up eventually, and this is where HIV will come back. So this is the major barrier to HIV cure. This is why there isn't a cure to HIV. Influenza is as well an RNA virus. It also goes into our nucleus, but it's not integrating into our genome, therefore it's easier to get it out. If we look on SARS, SARS is again an RNA virus. It's a plus strand virus, which means that the RNA genome of the virus that goes into the cell can directly, immediately start producing proteins. And therefore, the viruses are produced very, very fast. So there is a lot of virus very quickly within the infection. However, as opposed to HIV and influenza, it doesn't go into our nuclei. It's not integrating into our DNA. So, and it's also much more stable, larger virus, and the mutation rate is much smaller. So from that sense, it's a little bit better for us. I think it's going to be maybe easier in a way to find conserved sites of which we decide that we want to focus for a vaccine. However, having said that, there is also another problem with SARS that we witnessed with SARS coronavirus 1, the first cousin of the current epidemic, is that the spike protein that, again, we saw in your video is the major target for antibodies. This spike protein is a dual phase protein. It has two sides. It can elicit neutralizing antibodies, but it can probably also elicit harmful antibody responses that can cause major inflammation and maybe make the disease much worse. So we probably don't want to use the spike as is, and this is also probably why using the whole virus didn't work so far for SARS-1. We will need to figure out and find these like Achilles' heels of the virus, the size of vulnerability of the virus, reconstitute them somehow, stabilize them, and use these little portions as vaccines, and that is a difficult task.
So just to make sure that I understand it correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, you're actually optimistic with regard to the COVID-19, despite the difficulties that we had with previous iterations and other kinds of sicknesses, because actually, if I understand correctly, with the COVID-19, it attacks while it multiplies very quickly, but it only attacks the outside, it doesn't go into the heart of the cell. And so therefore, it attacks the cell more from the outside. And it's a much more stable type. We're not seeing as many mutations of it. All of those translate basically to sort of give us a sense of optimism that indeed we'll be able to come up with a medication in the near future.
So generally I'm optimistic. I didn't say I'm optimistic about a vaccine. The virus very much attacks the cell from the inside. It's just, it's not going into the genome of the cell. And we all know that the majority of the people infected with COVID-19 will eventually recover and be cured and probably even protected from reinfection. So this is a good sign for sure. And that makes, COVID-19 for me less scary than, for example, HIV for sure. But there are serious challenges, and I'm looking at the vaccine, COVID-19 vaccine tracker, and I see a lot of trials in phase 1. So Laura mentioned the Moderna trial. I mean, it looks great, but I must say I couldn't find any evidence for an RNA vaccine ever approved for humans. That's for me.
Yeah.
So really, it's interesting. This sort of ties into what Matti was talking also about before, about, I think you said there are over 90 different research projects going on right now globally. Do you think, and while I'm directing this at Matti, but definitely, Natalia and Laura, feel free to chime in as well. Do you think that the proliferation basically and the sheer number is actually, is it good or bad basically for the progress of the research? I mean, the fact that it's not decentralized, I imagine there's more secrets that are being maintained, so there's less sharing of information, or actually do you think that the competition is good?
I'm generally a believer in competition, and especially in development of new innovation. I think that's also, in Israel as well, when there's a crisis, you always find Israelis trying to come up with a solution, like the Tel Aviv labs that Natalia works in, or different companies, and even the government here and the Ministry of Defense here, which is trying to come up with at the Biologic Institute. So I personally believe that having, again, more shots on goal to try to solve this issue is, and this pandemic, is better rather than worse. The industry has issued guidelines for how it will work together and try to share information as relevant through different mechanisms. But again, you also have to think about antitrust, where our companies have restrictions from working together on specific issues. So I think collaboration is good, but having a good, healthy competition to be able to reach a solution is only beneficial for patients in this case, and provides the incentives accordingly.
I'll build on that. So I agree competition is good because it really drives everybody forward. I think we have a unique opportunity here, right? The only way to accelerate the development of a virus is if people are going to work together, because there are going to be only so many healthy volunteers that are going to volunteer to participate in this, and then there's going to be only so many people and populations that you can go out in to see if they get infected. So they're going to have to be unique potential trial designs and how people work together to really understand how this goes. I'm very optimistic. I can't remember what the acronym stands for. It's CEPI or CEPI, and so one of you can chime in because I can't remember right now. But they were formed at Davos in 2017 to really work together to try to prevent or really understand these viruses that were crossing over from animals into humans, and what was going to potentially be disease X, which is now COVID-19. What's the new pandemic that potentially is life-threatening? And they really have been trying to gather the universe of people like Natalia who work on vaccines or in the lab or antibodies, and really try to hone the science and really try to get people to work together. And yesterday there was a call to action in Science by Francis Collins and Fauci and leaders of CEPI to really have people work together, because there's only so many clinical designs and so many statisticians, and we're going to have to, in order, if we really think 12 to 18 months, I wish I was that optimistic. I don't want to put a downer on this, but 12 to 18 months is like literally would be a godsend. I mean, it would be beschirt to have that happen. I mean, it really, that's like, wow. As Natalia said, these RNA or DNA viruses have not ever been approved. They've never been mass produced. You not only have to think about running these clinical trials now in parallel to shorten timelines, but to have mass production at risk, which governments are going to have to provide funding to the companies that are going to be making these. And then you can produce them, but then you have to fill a vaccine into a vial or a syringe. I mean, the complication, and then you have cold storage. You got to get this around the world and the globe, usually through refrigeration. So, it's really, I think if we don't work together, one of the silver linings of this hopefully will be that we all do work together to be able to get to the finish line.
By the way, CEPI is Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations.
Thank you.
Not a problem.
I knew you would get me out of that.
It was created really a few years ago at Davos. I believe it's a foundation, but it includes government and private organizations basically. And I think, if I recall correctly, what they do is at the time they started prioritizing sort of different potential illnesses to sort of really work together on trying to explore, basically understand what they are and explore sort of medications for them. So, and how to treat them.
Mm-hmm.
So Matti, really, I mean, we hear a lot. I mean, I think, we hear a lot about competition, we hear a lot about cooperation, but you also brought up actually something very interesting that I don't think many people actually think about, and that is the risk of antitrust. And do you think that's an issue here? Do you think that given the crisis that, regulators might actually, shut an eye for it? Is there a risk that, somebody who might have lost the competition might actually initiate actions under those to prevent? I mean, where do you think it might go?
So I think this is another example of where government has actually shown positive flexibility specific for COVID and have issued regulations enabling healthy collaboration, like Laura mentioned, to be able to work together on COVID, whether on the supply chain or R&D regarding COVID-related treatments. So in that case, I don't see this as necessarily a risk, and I think companies have like ours, have established antitrust regulations internally to be able to make sure that we are fully compliant with the law. So in these type of cases, we are ultra sensitive to the restrictions, and therefore seek out guidance with the government to ask their guidance proactively when there is a need for any kind of easing up of these type of restrictions, ultimately, again, to help patients around the world in the United States and elsewhere. So we do adhere to the restrictions and then reach out to government, and government's been, in this case, over the last couple of months, both in the US and elsewhere in the world, very flexible, allowing healthy collaboration that doesn't infringe on the reasons we have antitrust regulations, which again are to protect consumers ultimately.
Thank you. Laura, did you see any antitrust issues back with the AIDS, or did you see this kind of cooperation, or was it really more sort of a bunker mentality?
I think HIV and AIDS were a little bit different, but similar and different. The companies that got into producing antivirals were the companies that were already producing antibiotics. And so those companies kind of all went forth and started to look at the disease. And remember, also the science behind the disease rolled out a lot slower than we have now. And so when we finally realized you needed more than one drug, you kind of almost had to work together, right? Because once you needed the cocktail, you needed one drug. And then everybody kind of then got really competitive again because they saw, I think, the profits that were involved. right? So you start coming together for goodwill and then people go. So it goes back and forth. But I think here's a very unique situation that allows us, you know, so it wasn't really antitrust, it's more competition.
Sure.
I also want to comment on the competition, you know, from the research side. I think that, you know, when we are in the very early research stage, so competition is definitely a good thing, right? Because everybody has their own ideas and we have to be original because, you know, otherwise everybody will just go in the same direction and this is not a good thing. But, you know, both Matti and Laura are more from the clinical and production side, and you know you're doing the real job. We're just playing here. So eventually, my question also in this regard to both Matti and Laura, whether you think there will be one solution or every sort of every country with its own research platform will come up with its own drug or its own vaccine, because eventually, you know, I'm thinking if there is a vaccine developed in the US, then obviously it will be given first to the American people, but then, you know, or if it's developed in the UK. So we will face some manufacturing and distribution bottlenecks. So, you know, is it possible, do you think it's possible that there will be, you know, the British vaccine, the Israeli vaccine, the American vaccine, and so on? There will be different ones.
That's a great question.
So I'll take it from my side. I don't think, you know, governments don't develop vaccines. Companies develop vaccines, and companies are not nationally based only. So even Teva as an Israeli-born company, we are truly global. So we have production and R&D in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere, and India as well. So I don't think that you will have country-based solutions.
Right,
and
but sorry for stopping you. Yeah, but
Yeah.
then also, you know, the consideration of the Institute for Biological Research or the NIH, I'm sure, or the Army, you know, the US
Yeah.
Army is, you know, we should be the ones to develop a vaccine to bring it to our people. So it's
right.
not,
So they will,
but it's more government research.
I think it's a valid,
yeah.
Go ahead, Matti.
Yeah, so they would start to develop it, but then to produce it, they wouldn't be able to produce it. So then they would have to work with partners to be able to help producing it and ultimately ramp up production to be able to produce it for worldwide. But it is a valid issue, Laura. Yes.
No, I was going to say it's a very valid concern. It's a valid concern because there are unfortunately some nationalistic trends that are going on in certain countries that you mentioned. And when you test this and produce it, you are not going to be able to produce it to the need that you're going to be able to vaccinate everyone that you need to vaccinate, and that it's going to take billions of dollars and a lot of time. Bill Gates had a beautiful editorial about how are we going to approach this and how do we support not only the industrialized nations, which will probably have more coordination and spread, but the low to middle income countries, and how are we going to do it. So it is a concern that I think people are aware of. I think people are also thinking, though, that we have a global mind, and that you can easily see from travel routes that the US is not just the US, and Europe is not just Europe, and China is not just China, because people integrate and intermingle. But it is a valid concern.
No, definitely. And I think, I think even up to now, we've already seen a lot of politicization of the discussion. And so, you know, hopefully we all stay optimistic, and hopefully we'll continue having the global approach. But it's definitely sometimes we are subject to the decision making by some of the politicians. But as we wrap up, though, I just wanted to sort of, there are a few questions from the audience, and I just wanted to make sure that we had addressed. I mean, we addressed some of them, but another couple that have not yet been addressed is, one question is whether you believe that a prophylactic low-dose medication could be the solution to help people transit from lockdown to open socialization.
I'll take that. If we had a medication that we thought we actually knew would work, and then potentially, you know, so that approach is taken in HIV today, where there's medications that are known to work to actually stop the virus, and that they're given on a regular prophylactic basis. we're far from that in this disease. So probably a race to the vaccine is probably easier at this point. I don't know if anybody else has an opinion.
Yeah, I agree. I think, you know, if we can, we heard a lot of discussions about the antibodies. I do believe that the antibodies, if we have neutralizing antibodies, these can be used as prophylactic drugs for population at risk, people who are immunosuppressed after, you know, organ transplantation or on chemotherapy, or, you know, people who are now afraid to leave the house. They can potentially maybe get a shot of broadly neutralizing antibody that was isolated from a different person and be protected for a few weeks.
And I think that Natalia brings up a really point. It's really the people who are really high risk, who have comorbidities or age related, right? The majority of the patients here who get coronavirus, 40% or more, maybe a little bit more, are completely asymptomatic. And 80% of the people do well and recover well. You know, more than 80% of the people do well and recover well. So I think we lose that in thinking about this virus, and we have to remind ourselves of that. So the prophylaxis really would be for a really high at-risk population.
Got it. And thank you. So, and another question is actually dealing more with the Israeli side of it. So over the last few weeks, we've heard several announcements coming from Israel about pending medications, vaccinations, and which some of them have actually been tested, some of them with decent results, even though the N, I think, was very low. I think there was one that included stem cell therapy from a Haifa company. I don't know, Mati, I don't know if you might have more information, but can anyone of you comment on this? Is Israel on the verge of a breakthrough ahead of others or not, or is it all?
So I'll just say, and maybe Natalia, Laura, you can comment also, but like I said before, anytime there's a place of need, what do innovators do? They find an unmet need and they provide a solution to it. And Israelis have a lot of innovators and a lot of chutzpahdik innovators that see a global pandemic and see a global problem and want to come up with a solution. So anywhere you see such a problem, you'll find Israelis trying to solve it. You have both vaccination projects like this MIGVAX vaccination project, which in the north of Israel, called Migal, right outside of Kiryat Shmona, and they took a project which was ongoing to help in veterinarian studies and are trying to pivot it towards a vaccination. They just raised around $12 million through our crowd and crowdsourcing funds. They're very far from a solution in this case, but have some early promising science to try to build on and a lot of good PR. Secondly, I would say is Pluristem, the company you mentioned. So that's actually a very more well-established company, which is a startup that's been developing and providing different stem cell treatments. And like many other companies, they pivoted in their treatments towards trying to help with the COVID crisis, and have actually treated a few patients in New Jersey successfully. Now, it's not a vaccination, it's a treatment for specific types of COVID patients, but that could be very promising, and they're continuing with their studies and development phases as well. They did receive FDA approval to continue with a new study as well recently. So again, it's another example of a government responding quickly to be able to provide a fast approval to proceed with a study. You have also a lot of digital health companies which are which are developing capabilities to be able to diagnose quicker. So a lot of Israeli digital health startups, including those that Teva's invested in through our Sonara Ventures, like Vocalis, which is an Amun investment company, which is using vocal capabilities in partnership with the Ministry of Defense that they're partnering with to test it out, to try to diagnose through your voice, through the smartphone, whether or not you have COVID. We have a company, Teva, called through Sonara Ventures, called My Home Doc, which is a device you put on your smartphone, and you can do pretty much all primary care diagnostics through your smartphone. And that we are also piloting with several hospitals here in Israel to see whether or not that can be used to diagnose COVID-19. There was a huge, the last thing I'll mention, there was a huge PR sent out last week. Again, this happens sometimes when you mix politics and science, but the Minister of Defense came out here in Israel, Bennett, and announced that the Center for Biological Research, the National Center for Biological Research that Natalia mentioned before, had a breakthrough in antibodies and protein. So yes, it's very promising. It's not different. I wouldn't say that what they're doing is different necessarily than other breakthroughs that have occurred throughout the world. But it's very promising that you have smart Israeli people that are working on this. And again, it makes me proud to be Israeli when you see all this spirit coming out there around that.
That's great news. So I'd like to end this on an up note. Question for each one of you. I think we've touched on some of it, but if in 2 sentences, if you can tell me, what is the positive thing that you see coming out of this crisis? Natalia.
So I hope that there will be more financial investment in infectious diseases. I feel like, at least in Israel, over the last years, most of the funding went to cancer and Alzheimer's because there was sort of a conception that infectious diseases is something that belongs to the developing countries and not it's not here, it's not ours. So we should invest in in more in other diseases, and I hope that now funding agencies will understand that it's not the case that infectious diseases can basically come back and block our life. So we should invest in research. And not only when there is an epidemic, because everyone keeps asking when there will be a vaccine, when there will be treatment, when are you coming up with an antibody? So it doesn't work like that. It takes years and it takes a lot of money and effort to figure out these viruses and figure out vaccines and antivirals. And I think that, we should understand that these viruses will come back in that form or another. So we should start investing in the research sooner rather than later.
Sure. So basically, awareness that infectious disease is a global issue and not just a third world problem.
Right. When I did my PhD several years ago, I was focusing on SARS coronavirus 1 because it was right after the outbreak of first SARS. And I remember very clearly my PhD, one of my committee advisors asked me, but come on, who cares about SARS? It's a mild flu and it's just went away and disappeared as it came. So it's I think we all know who cares about SARS now.
Everybody, yes. Laura.
So I think I mentioned it earlier. I'm really hoping that this leads to more cooperation. I see what I see that's really interesting is I think there's a lot of more creativity, not only on the science side, but if you watch all the YouTubes and all the songs and all the people getting together musically, I mean, it's just unbelievable. And so the cooperation, the connectivity, the creativity and the communication, I hope that we come out of this a different population globally with some of these things that we really kind of lean on and lean into as our new basis and foundations of working together.
That it survives the crisis and continues.
Yeah.
I think that's lovely. I think that's a great thing. Mati.
So I'll say as a father who's got to spend the last couple of months a lot more time with my children than I have in the past. And in the past few years, I've had a lot of very good quality time and lost a lot of Monopoly games to my kids. So I'm very happy to be able to spend that time at balancing between work and home. And hopefully that'll continue to some degree. I think the mutual understanding between people that we are all facing the same reality, which is new and unexpected. You can see really in the human interactions that we are generating a lot more mutual understanding and patience for each other, I think, than I've ever experienced in work in the past. As an industry for Teva, so in the pharmaceutical industry, we've probably enjoyed quote unquote, quite a negative reputation over the past few years in the pharmaceutical industry, and Teva is part of that. In that sense, probably some of it's deserved to a degree. I think this crisis now, as Natalia mentioned, really puts forefront the value and the importance of our industry also to the world as producers of medicines. That yes, there are areas we should fix and work on as pharmaceutical companies, but just us as one company driving $42 billion in savings to the U.S. healthcare system every year, and that's just one company out of many. There is some value to our industry, and hopefully the reputation and the acknowledgement of that will continue to be as strong as we've seen over the last couple months in that trend.
Definitely. I wish you all the best of success from the bottom of my heart. So first of all, thank you very much. Thanks. This has been fascinating. It's been educational, and I really appreciate the time, despite the difficulties we had at the beginning. Steve, do you want to say something as we wrap up?
Well, thank you, and thank you to all the panelists. Part of why I founded Blue Star was to link Israeli innovation to the world and to the United States, and this just inspires me. And so I see the innovation. Of course, we all pray for a cure. In my gut, in my kishkas, I'm hoping it's going to come from Israel and U.S.-Israel collaboration. And I just thank everyone for participating.
Thanks. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So thank you, and really, I joined that, and so just as we wrap up, I just wanted to mention once again, as part of the community building efforts that we're talking about, as you know, unfortunately, the America-Israel Friendship League cannot lend a hand in developing a vaccination or a medication. So we try to focus on what we can do. It's trying to give a sense of community through these webinars, educate people, take people's mind, help ease people's mind, as well as also the weekly donation, trying to bring a smile basically to those people that are helping us out in the medical front. And so with that in mind, as you know, each week we basically send a donation of nearly 50 pounds of Israeli sweets to medical staff around the country. And this week we are announcing that our 7th donation of $500 worth of Israeli goods will be going out to the NYU Medical Center in New York City. We do ask if you can, in this community, if you can help, reach out to us, let us know if you can identify medical personnel, medical centers, and that would appreciate this kind of boost and support. You'll see on the screen our various electronic addresses. Feel free to basically send us an information. Once again, thank you very much for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again on future webinars at all age levels. As you can see, we do not discriminate against age. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you,
Bye,
everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
That was a Ronald Reagan quote. That was a good one.